Last year, the European Commission released the findings of the first ever EU-wide survey on loneliness. Contained within it was a remarkable statistic that led to some discussion, though not nearly enough. Of all the countries studied, the highest level of recorded loneliness was here in Ireland, where more than 20% of respondents said they were lonely most or all of the time. This was a startling finding, all the more so because the authors of the study noted that generally the prevalence of loneliness decreases with increased age, income and education, and the Irish people are one of the youngest, wealthiest and best educated countries in the European Union. There's no reason why we should have topped this list, and yet we did. In recent months, the Green Party has responded to this problem, proposing measures to tackle loneliness and promote the sort of communities which bring people together regularly, turning neighbours into partners and strangers into friends. The Green Party's Shannon motion called for many measures, including the appointment of a minister with responsibility for tackling loneliness, the establishment of an expert action group, the mandating of strategies at local authority level, and a range of other proposed actions designed to help voluntary organisations, sporting groups, community choirs and so forth. The Green Party has an honourable history when it comes to bringing issues such as environmentalism and localism to the centre of political debate. That is why, despite their size, they have been the most influential political party in Ireland in recent times. Unfortunately, the measures they have suggested do not get to the heart of the matter in diagnosing the cause of this national ailment. Without an accurate diagnosis, no cure is likely to be found. Why did a famously parochial nation become a place of such isolation? What brought about this diminution of the independent capacity for communal activism, the sort of activism without which Irish independence could never have been achieved? What has gone wrong, and how can it be set right? Ireland is lonelier than other European countries, but we are not unusual in experiencing the consequences of the decline of community. A similar process has occurred across the world's advanced democracies. In the year 2000, Harvard's Professor Robert Putnam came to worldwide attention following the publication of his book, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. Within this book, which clearly inspired our then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, whose endorsement adorns the back cover of at least one edition, Putnam described how, from the 1960s onwards, Americans had become less likely to join civic organisations or trade unions, less likely to vote, less likely to entertain guests in their home, less likely to engage in many other activities which had made America a shining example of a participatory democracy. Americans still enjoyed bowling, Putnam wrote, but the data showed that instead of taking part in bowling leagues as had been the common practice, many more Americans were bowling alone. Here in Ireland, we can see evidence of a similar process of communal decline, which has affected many institutions. Around 60% of Irish workers were trade union members in the early 1980s. This has fallen to a figure of around 25% today. The Irish public has less interest in a shared national media than it did a generation ago. Print readership is down, many newspapers have closed or downsized significantly to the detriment of local and national reportage. Radio Telefíséireann's travails over the last 18 months relate to malpractice and poor governance, but the real existential problem is the dwindling interest in domestic programming. The days of major RTE programmes bringing the country together as one and setting the agenda culturally are over. In measuring the health of institutions, statistics on public trust are very useful. According to new CSO data, trust in media is down in Ireland, as is trust in government. One of the most consequential societal developments in America in recent years, and one which has been studied by Robert Putnam and others, has been the gradual decline in church attendance. This is perhaps the most obvious example of a decline in communal activity here in Ireland, one which was welcomed by a considerable cohort of the population which is hostile to religion. Those who desire a fully secular Ireland have COVID-19 and the government's lockdown policies to thank for the progress which has been recorded in recent years. As shown by the Morrick research study last year, 4 in 10 people who went to Mass prior to COVID no longer do so. Usually, declining Mass attendance is portrayed as a sign of fading confidence in an institution which much of Ireland's political and media class dislike. Another way of viewing this process is the ending of a cultural practice which saw the great majority of people in each community coming together each week in buildings which were the centre of their community in both a physical and metaphorical sense, but which now lie empty for the most part. Considered in this light, secularisation merely represents another form of atomisation in this lonely New Ireland, where recent research suggests that more than 40% of adults have a mental health disorder. There can be little doubt that the new epidemic of loneliness is strongly related to this new epidemic of mental illness. Indeed, the Green Party's motion places a strong emphasis on measures needed to tackle the mental health problems which are surely worsened by the breakdown of community. One particularly noteworthy feature of modern community life in Ireland is the degree to which it is not spontaneous or independent, but instead state-directed and state-funded. When one considers the major representative bodies in Ireland, those which speak for particular population cohorts like older people, those with disabilities and so forth, we see an acronym which previous generations would not have recognised: NGO. As is in the name, these are meant to be non-governmental in nature, but in practice, many could not function without regular injections of state funding. To be clear, there is nothing inherently wrong with NGOs receiving this funding. The money is used to provide services which are a crucial part of the extensive social protection system which any prosperous and decent society should have. But this funding also creates an obvious dependence on the state, while reducing the need for the sort of mass participation which civic organisations require to stay healthy in the long term. It also distances the representative group from the group of people they are supposed to represent. A spectacular example of this, or where this can lead, was seen just a few months ago. In the run-up to the March referendums, the National Women's Council of Ireland campaigned aggressively to remove references to mothers and the role of women in the home from our constitution. Yet on referendum day, the overwhelming majority of Manana Heron dissented. The dramatic contrast between what the nation's women taught and what the National Women's Council taught can best be understood by examining the funding of an organisation which derives more than 96% of its staffing costs from grants from government departments or public entities like the HSE. Were the National Women's Council accountable to Irish women in any democratic manner, the referendum results would surely have led to a reckoning. Instead, the results simply represented a sharp rebuke to another arm of a defeated government, with the National Women's Council limping onwards and continuing their work. The National Women's Council is not exceptional in this regard. What is exceptional is the degree to which this situation is now treated as normality. Traditionally, Ireland's people were more than capable of independent community activism. In fact, it was such activism which laid the foundations of this state. As outlined in a new book edited by John Cunningham and Terry Dunn, Spirit of Revolution, Ireland from Below 1917 to 1923, the most pivotal years in our country's struggle for independence were marked by diverse forms of mass participation in shared causes, not directed by the state, but directed against a foreign state in some cases, and in some cases even replacing that foreign state. In the years following the Dublin lockout, there was a massive increase in union membership, with membership of unions affiliated to the Irish Trade Union Congress rising from around 100,000 in 1916 to 225,000 in 1920. Sinn Féin's triumph in the 1918 general election was part of a mass movement which saw more than 110,000 people join the party, which was arranged into 1,300 clubs scattered nationwide. With this mass membership in place during the War of Independence, Sinn Féin was then able to establish almost 1,000 courts by the time of the truce, severing Ireland's people from Britain's judicial system. All of this had an impact on the British government, perhaps an even greater impact than the guerrilla campaign waged by the IRA. Local resistance can be overcome by imperial militaries, and usually is. Defeating a unified nation determined to break free is another matter entirely. The roots of Irish freedom had been planted long before this, and it is worth remembering that every advance towards freedom involves initiatives where Irish people work together on a large scale. O'Connell's Catholic Association was one of the first mass membership organisations in all the world, and it achieved Catholic emancipation. In just a few generations, the Land League's spectacular success brought about the ending of landlordism in Ireland, so that the percentage of landlord-owned land fell from 97% in 1870 to just 3% 60 years later. The first cooperative creamery was established in Limerick in 1889. By 1920, there were more than 1,000 such cooperative societies in Ireland, comprising 150,000 members. Of course, the late 19th century was also the era in which Irish people came together and developed a mass membership organisation capable of reviving Gaelic games through a process of detailed organisation of sporting activities. If the GAA had not come into being, there is every chance that Gaelic games would eventually have become the sporting equivalent of spoken Irish, a relic of a bygone age existing only in isolated parts of the country. We do not appreciate how close we came to this outcome. Marcus de Burke's official history of the GAA described how in the aftermath of the famine, the sport of cricket, with the support of British colonial officials, made major inroads across large swathes of rural Ireland where hurling had previously been dominant, including my native Kilkenny. The GAA's defeat of this element of the Anglicisation agenda was a demonstration of de facto independence before de jure independence was a reality. It was also a textbook example of successful organisation from the level of parish up without any government direction, government support or government funding. Here the word parish is deserving of additional consideration. When explaining her party's motion on loneliness, the Green Party Senator Pauline O'Reilly said that politicians needed to look at how best to give people the time to join in social communities, like church choirs or sports teams. A secularised society, though, is by definition a deparochialised society. To this day, much of what makes up civil society in Ireland is either to some extent part of the Catholic Church or was originally inspired by its clergy or laity. That includes many of our well-known charities and NGOs, the likes of St Vincent de Paul, housing charities, community groups like Winter na Tíre, and so forth. One of Robert Putnam's best books focuses on the role of religion in American society, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. In it, Putnam and his co-author highlight evidence showing that religiously engaged people are more likely to be engaged in community life more generally, including by being more likely to donate time and money to various non-religious causes. The author suggests that this may be due to the fact that religiously based ties are morally freighted in a way that most secular ties are not. Coming together for prayer likely means more to people than coming together for Pilates or so forth. Applied to the Irish context, these figures could help to explain the Catholic Church's disproportionate role in the development of modern community in Ireland. But of course, this has been changing significantly. There is little serious consideration today about the future of community in an Ireland where religious practice is increasingly uncommon and will become more so. The Church's role in modern Irish society has been deliberately minimised, with crude caricature replacing historical facts. A story of a post-independent handover of power to the clergy has been repeated ad nauseum. The reality is that the Catholic Church's infrastructure in Ireland, unusually by European standards, was not developed by the state, but often in spite of it. 3 centuries after having its property stolen by a foreign power, impoverished Irish Catholics in the 19th century gradually began to rebuild their churches, schools and other institutions brick by brick. When the Irish departed for foreign shores, Irish clergy and laity showed the same organisational genius in constructing the Catholic churches and school systems in America, Australia and elsewhere. None of this could have been achieved had the Irish people of the 19th century been a lonely and disconnected people. For all our prosperity, though, something appears to have been lost along the way. Although modern Ireland appears to be struggling socially to an abnormal degree, we are not alone in this. Putnam's research on the decline of community, reinforced over the last quarter of a century by a range of other social scientists, particularly in America, has relevance to most Western societies. Many traditionally strong institutions have been hemorrhaging members. One only needs to look at the performances of many long-established European political parties in recent elections to see how the public's attachment to parties is fading. Last year, the World Health Organization announced a new commission on social connection to address loneliness as a pressing health threat. And it has now been 6 years since the British government launched its first loneliness strategy. We're likely to see more warnings and initiatives such as this internationally. Over the last number of years, political commentators have warned of the threats mounting against liberal democracy. There are many ways in which liberal democracy or modern liberalism can be defined as a philosophy. All of these place a strong emphasis on individualism, individual rights. This is often characterized as being in opposition to the cultural or social mores of the past, particularly in a country like Ireland where there has been such a strong reaction against traditionalism. The American political scientist Professor Patrick Deneen recently wrote that liberalism's architects proposed a vision of freedom as liberation from limitations imposed by birthright. These limitations, Deneen went on to suggest, included those deriving from the sort of communal institutions which connected people to their neighbours. The realisation of a new liberty, he said, required the dismantling of older institutions that had cultivated the classical ideal of liberty. What had previously been considered as guardrails came instead to be regarded as oppressions and unjust limitations upon individual liberty. As a result, the advance of liberal liberty has meant the gradual and then accelerating weakening, redefining and overthrowing of many formative institutions and practices of human life, whether family, the community, a vast array of associations, schools and universities, architecture, the arts and even churches. In their place, a flattened world arose, the wide open spaces of liberal freedom, a vast and widening playground for the project of self-creation, Deneen wrote. Professor Deneen is not the first academic to detect problems within the liberal political ideology which has governed most Western societies for several generations. Decades before this, in his book After Virtue, the Scottish-American philosopher Professor Alistair MacIntyre criticised liberalism for making it more difficult to build and sustain forms of community directed towards the shared achievement of those common goods without which the ultimate human good cannot be achieved. It is not necessary to consult post-liberals like Deneen or other sceptical voices like MacIntyre to understand this aspect of the liberal project. Rousseau's 18th century writings would have an enormous influence on political thought in general and on the thought of the French revolutionaries in particular. Rousseau felt that non-state social institutions were an infringement on individual liberty, and that the goal should be to establish one strong centralised state structure and to ensure that each citizen would then be completely independent of all his fellow men and absolutely dependent upon the state. Today's political context is mercifully free of much actual oppression of communities, though. If community is weaker than it was, it is because individuals have freely chosen to focus on their own goals in pursuit of happiness. If civil society is less vibrant, it is because people have withdrawn their support from the institutions which were previously at the centre of their lives. Many people now think that it is the job of the state to carry out many of the functions which used to be performed by community groups or families. After all, the state is democratic, and its agencies are all subject to some kind of oversight by way of regular democratic elections. In contrast, many community or civic organisations are not fully democratic, and the key method of expressing dissatisfaction is voting with one's feet and departing. There are problems with this approach, though. One key point is that the decline of community participation does not occur at similar rates across all strands of society. In the United States, it has been observed that civic disengagement appears to be more noticeable among lower income groups. Professor Charles Murray's book, his 2012 book titled Losing Ground, posits that America has broken down along class lines into two societies, which now differ sharply when it comes to labour participation, family structure and lifestyle, not to mention politics. Although the social science evidence about what has been occurring in Ireland is not nearly as extensive compared to the United States, we see some signs of a similar dynamic here in Ireland's more disadvantaged areas where community organisations are not always as active. This creates a dangerous dynamic where atomisation can be at its strongest in those areas where people are in need of the greatest social support. In such environments, the demand for more government action and spending grows, to the point where it risks overburdening the state. With no strong community in existence, the necessity for more NGO influence increases, and with it comes the demand from the NGOs for more funding. It is clear that social spending across the board has increased massively in recent years here, but it is less clear that this has had a meaningful impact. Budget 24 included a phenomenal 25 billion in social protection spending. The next budget is going to pass the 100 billion mark for the first time. NGOs, which pass for civil society in today's Ireland, dedicate a considerable proportion of their time to advocating on behalf of increased funding for their own specific sectors. It is difficult at times, though, to detect much benefit derived from this. Even if the status quo is financially sustainable in an Ireland where tax revenues are thankfully buoyant, there is a social cost to creating a country where people's most important social attachment is to the state itself, or to bodies which are funded almost exclusively by the state. The centralised state is where many people access the resources they need to live a secure and dignified life, yet it is rarely the place where people find the greatest meaning or purpose. Engaging with the government's apparatus is not where people build meaningful relationships or where they forge lasting friendships. While arguing for a renewed emphasis on institutional involvement to help repair American society, the writer Yuval Levin wrote that flourishing happens in the joints of society, and this is also where the deepest source of trouble shows itself. In other words, many of our struggles seem rooted in relational problems: loneliness and isolation, mistrust and suspicion, alienation and polarization. These are the characteristic maladies of this era. America represents the best example of where community and political discourse has gone horribly wrong. Around the time that John F. Kennedy ascended to the presidency, the United States stood out both for the vibrancy of its civil society institutions and for the vibrancy of its political institutions. This optimistic spirit was clearly evident across American society. What appears to exist in the world's most important democracy today are two tribes which share little in common and hate one another with a passionate intensity. Whereas in the past, Democrats and Republicans would encounter one another in many different areas of life aside from the political sphere, in today's more individualistic environment, they face one another as strangers whose lives do not often intersect. Social media and the advent of hyper-partisan media outlets which profit from appealing to the extremes have certainly played a major role in the coarsening of dialogue in America. At this point, there appears to be little hope for a lowering of the temperature. Recently, a film titled Civil War depicted an America which had descended into outright military conflict. Some years ago, this would have seemed like a preposterous storyline. Now, not so much. A top-down solution to America's problems no longer appears possible. A bottom-up solution could offer some hope. For now, though, those in other advanced democracies should consider the process which has led to this division and act to reduce the risks of a similar outcome. In the political sphere, many developments on this side of the Atlantic already resemble what has occurred in America. Mainstream political parties are struggling across many European countries. Populists are seeking to fill a vacuum. Identity politics is more prominent. Political commentary is more aggressive, with the internet proving to be an easy place to express hatred for politicians and others. While the recent election suggested there has been no major breakthrough of extremist forces yet in Ireland, many of the conditions are in place to allow for it to happen eventually. A nation of strangers can become a nation of enemies very quickly. For this reason, and many others, we need to consider the ways in which community could be restored in Ireland. As Francis Fukuyama has written, there is a limited number of paths to sociability or social connectivity. The first is based on family and kinship, the second on voluntary associations, outside kinship, such as schools, clubs and professional organisations, and the third is the state. Social developments which have occurred in recent decades in the wake of the growth of the state and the parallel decline of voluntary organisations, associations, points to a need for a rebalancing when it comes to state authority and non-state civil society. This will not be easy, however. Nobody but the most centralising authoritarian could be openly opposed to community. Nobody was forced to dedicate less time and energy to community life in recent decades. There are often benefits to a more individualistic way of life, and there is certainly a cost to being part of any coherent community in the long term. In the mid-1990s, the American journalist Alan Ehrenholz wrote a book called The Lost City about his hometown of Chicago. In it, he described the communities which existed in the mid-20th century, such as the Catholic parish or the close-knit African-American neighbourhood. Speaking to those who had lived through that era in the 90s, Ehrenholz detected a clear desire to restore much of what had been lost, that sense of togetherness and safety, that sense of knowing one's neighbours and being able to rely on them. However, Ehrenholz also recognised that the existence of the strong communities in post-war Chicago was made possible by a force of moral authority which limited people's individuality and imposed burdens on them which most would now chafe at. If people who mourned the passing of a more coherent community actually wanted to restore it, they would also have to restore the forms of authority which their parents or grandparents had accepted. To worship choice and community together is to misunderstand what community is all about, Ehrenholz wrote. Continuing, community means not subjecting every action in life to the burden of choice, but rather accepting the familiar and reaping the psychological benefits of having one less calculation to make in the course of the day. There is one particular reason why it would be wisest to reinvigorate community life in Ireland now. Ireland was an ethnically homogenous environment up until relatively recently. This in and of itself did not generate strong community bonds. The south of Italy has long struggled when it comes to developing social capital, in spite of its people sharing an ethnic background, a language, and a very structured and geographically well-organised religion. Robert Putnam's America, on the other hand, developed a rich civic culture in the 19th and 20th centuries, in spite of its diversity and its lack of a unifying religion. That being said, it seems obvious that having a relatively similar culture and backgrounds should make the task of building and sustaining a national community more straightforward. Ireland, in the last 3 decades or less, has become a multi-ethnic society. According to the last census, 1 in 5 of the people who live here were not born here. The fact that this social change has occurred without much social unrest has been a remarkable accomplishment, proof that Ireland's communities are still capable of absorbing newcomers. Yet in the last few years, as we are all aware, immigration has become a contentious issue for the first time. Aside from honestly assessing the ability of a small country with a housing crisis to cope with the unprecedented numbers of arrivals, we need to be realistic about the impact which this level of immigration will have on social cohesion. In particular, we should acknowledge the evidence put forward by none other than Robert Putnam. In the noughties, Putnam, a left-of-centre progressive supporter of the Democratic Party, analysed the link between ethnic diversity and social capital and community, and he came to some stark findings. The evidence, he wrote in 2007, suggested that in ethnically diverse neighbourhoods, residents of all races tend to hunker down. Trust, even of one's own race, is lower. Altruism and community cooperation rarer. Friends fewer. Everybody trusts everybody less in more diverse settings, Putnam said. Volunteerism and philanthropy and civic engagement, involvement in the community, all of that tends to decline. Diversity seems to bring out the turtle in all of us, Putnam explained. Robert Putnam's work was controversial to the point where he himself was reluctant to publish his findings at first, even though he made clear that this turtle effect, where people kind of retreat inwards into themselves, it was not a permanent condition. Newly diverse societies could overcome the initial social fragmentation, and America had done so in the run-up to the mid-20th century. We still are not having a proper debate on immigration in Ireland, but if this changes, one key aspect of the discussion needs to be focused on the measures needed to bring newcomers and natives together at a local level. Local integration at a community level should be the first step. If this were achieved, national integration would almost become a formality. In the meantime, and as we face into a period where social trust may decline, the risk of a nativist backlash still exists, and this is one of the main reasons why a communitarian type approach is all the more desirable. Many of the populist movements throughout the West offer nostalgia as public policy, speaking to isolated citizens who no longer recognise their communities. Demagogic figures on the right often point to a simpler bygone age and pretend that it can be recreated. Meanwhile, on the left, there remains an unhealthy emphasis on statist solutions to these problems, instead of a recognition of the importance of the mediating institutions which exist between the individual and the state. The state cannot bring people together on its own. Individuals cannot do this on their own. Only communities can accomplish such feats. Collective activity is always too complex to be able to be expressed through the single and unique organ of the state, the father of sociology Emile Durkheim wrote in the 1890s, that time of great civic action here in Ireland. He continued, "Where the state is the only environment in which men can live communal lives, they inevitably lose contact. They become detached, and thus society disintegrates." We cannot let that sort of disintegration occur here in Ireland. We have some reasons for hope. The fact that the existence of mass loneliness is being acknowledged as a problem represents progress. So too does the inauguration of the country's first directly elected mayor of Limerick. At last, local governments may be given the role in Irish society that it deserves. 3 years ago, Ireland lost one of its greatest but little known intellectuals, and the man who did most to highlight the importance of community. Desmond Fennell was an extraordinary intellectual who wrote dozens of books and pamphlets on a range of topics, including the need for regional self-government in the Gaeltacht and nationwide. In the 1960s, Desmond Fennell relocated from Dublin with his wife and children to live in Weenish off the coast of Connemara. There, he would become heavily involved in efforts to secure local autonomy and economic regeneration, two factors which he believed could help save the Gaeltacht and revive Connacht. At the same time, Fennell, would also become one of the country's most important and influential social commentators, and he used his column in the Sunday press to counteract the view that the Irish people were simply a mass of individuals, while arguing for an alternative approach to realise the vision of what he called a community of communities. To Fennell, this crusade was not just about saving the national language or stemming the exodus of immigration from Connemara and Connacht. It was something more fundamental and was at the core about realising Irish freedom. "We become our full selves," he wrote, "not in individual isolation, but through association with others, and primarily through association with our historical fellow travellers. Collective organisms of ancestral memory are necessary buttresses of our freedom." As Desmond Fennell did, as the tenants of the Land League did, as the founders of the GAA did, we must come together in the smallest or largest of ways to continue this work of community today. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, James. So our thanks to James Bradshaw for that very interesting and thought-provoking address on the human, person and community. So is there anybody with any questions or observations? This gentleman down here. We'll break for lunch in a few minutes, but we'll take some questions first.
Hi. I suppose my question, I'm glad you tied loneliness and isolation together. And you mentioned the turtle shell, how people retreated back in when they were kind of lost. And I'm glad you did leave with a positive, because a lot of it was making me, oh gee, we're finished here. But that's not a criticism. That's maybe what a lot of people really feel. But you talked about America, JFK saying, we're going to put a man on the moon. So give a focus. And the American dream, whatever that is. A lot of people say you have to be asleep to be having it. But at least there's something. And I suppose when you see our own country, we don't have that. who are we? What are we? Who are we going to be? And I suppose there's a lack of an answer for that for a lot of people. And you mentioned how, political parties, they've all went to the centre. You see maybe the two parties together. The previous speaker, I'd love to have asked him, but I thought he had to go. What does he think of, all that? Like, people felt, oh, I'm Fine Gael, I'm Fianna Fáil, I'm Sinn Féin, I know something. But, that's all centre ground. But even on a bigger scale, what do you think is the one kind of, say, this is Irish, I can stand up now, I know that I identify as Irish. It's not necessarily that I play football or speak a language or so on. Do we need to say we're sending somebody to the moon, or some focus, some one collective focus? People maybe had that in the past, and what would you see to make people come out of that shell? And again, you mentioned about it's a long question, I suppose, and I know I'm conscious of that. Like, for example, fear seems to have replaced a lot of these things, and you mentioned church attendance. Like, COVID is more or less over, accepted, or you might have it, but you're not going to die, or you're whatever position you're in with it. We still don't shake hands at Mass. So that residue of fear still exists. Now, that's a long question. I hope you're sorry. Okay.
Okay, James.
Yeah, well, it's a very good example, the sending the man to the moon, and that Kennedy had that aspiration in the early 1960s, then it was ultimately fulfilled at the end of the 1960s. What I think about that is, like, it was very much the product of an optimistic age. And I think part of that optimism came from the fact that Americans came together into such a degree in small things. And if you can work together in small things and have an optimistic vision about the future, then it's a little bit easier to have this massive national aspiration. I think it was hundreds of thousands of people worked on the Apollo project and ultimately had that success in the end. As for what we could have in Ireland when it comes to a national aspiration where we could work together more in terms of community, I think what Bertie was discussing when it came to Irish unity, that's a national aspiration. And I think it very much is something where those kind of community bonds on a small scale, any kind of work that people are doing there to connect with other people within this state, or more importantly, to connect with people in the next state and to connect within that society, that very divided society, to build those kind of links. I think when you have those kind of communal links at a small scale, I think it can help to achieve those kind of larger, big aspirations when it comes to sending a man to the moon or uniting the country. But I think it's very much like you see in American politics now how, like, people who are detached from others, people who are isolated, they're not going to have a positive vision, and they're not going to want to work together for a shared future, for a new kind of reality there. So I think the issues are very much interconnected in that sense.
Okay, we have another question here in the middle.
This gentleman here, I think.
Sorry, I'm just going with Michael here. Is it?
Thank you very much. One issue I think that probably needs to be addressed is the power of social media. That on average, young people, we say in America now, spend 8 hours on their phone every day. And the other thing is the relationships between men and women, and the power of the dating apps, which is destroying the possibilities for people to engage with each other outside of the digital world. I'm very pessimistic about this. And I take your point in relation to loneliness and in relation to communities. But the atomization of individuals is no accident. And I think this is where I think if the government, the NGOs and the government, and I agree with you that the state should not be responsible for communities having friendships with each other. That's a very personal thing. But the state does have a responsibility to look at the cultural effects of certain forms of technology and the way that they're used. I mean, the amount of money that's going into the system, and I don't see anybody really addressing this in any kind of a fierce way, which I think we should do, because I think it's like a cancer. So thank you for your work in relation to this. I'm very I'm admiring what you're saying, but I think unless we address the power of the technology and get control over it, we're on hiding to nowhere.
Yeah, I'd broadly agree with that. And one of the things that Robert Putnam, I keep mentioning Putnam again and again because he's the key kind of political scientist when it comes to community in America and more generally. One of the pieces of research he uncovered, it was in relation to social media, and he was looking at the impact of forming friendships on mental health, and he looked at the impact of forming online friendships on mental health. And basically, there was no change whatsoever when it came to online friendships. They didn't fulfill the same role when it came to in-person connections there. And I think the legacy of COVID is going to be, very toxic when it comes to those years of people being more remote from one another. So I'd agree with all that. Yeah.
We have one or two more questions.
I just
Kevin
try to
here.
keep the question very quick and make a very short statement. It would be. Thank you very much for the talk, James. Interesting to hear you. It would be interesting to have it would be impossible, but interesting to have statistics on loneliness. But the second point would be, if I'm allowed to disagree with you, I think there's a tremendous. I'm Irish. We're allowed to say that, aren't we? I think there's a tremendous community in this country, and without going off on a big waggle tail, I've found other countries where there isn't. Personally, loneliness can be a highly creative thing. Artistic people require to go away. In fact, it's a problem being in a family and being artistic. You need to go away sometimes joyfully for 4 or 5 days completely on your own. It's not quite prison, where I've worked in prisons. But the final thing is, it's fascinating that we have the challenges of immigration. I think it's fantastic. I want more people to come in. I can't house 100 people, but I want people. There's a tent here. There's vast spaces. I'd love to see 10, 12 million people shoot into our, our population to reach that. But to come back to the direct question to you, do you have a type of, some type of negative, impact about this whole thing? Because it doesn't seem that way to me at all.
But I think
Very communal. This morning in Roscommon, there was a dispute on Main Street about parking, and I was actually emotionally moved the way people came out of the shops, and without the Gardaí, it kind of ended in humour and jokes. I didn't want to. I thought it was fantastic. I thought, wow, this is one town. There were two people bickering over the parking. That's community. Community solved the problem.
I certainly think we have preserved a greater degree of community than England, for instance. I'm always struck when I'm in rural England, the difference in rural England and rural Ireland. There isn't the same sense of connectivity at all there. But I think when you look at the overall individual metrics for community, there's certainly been a decline in Ireland. I think the European Commission findings are very, very stark in that sense.
Okay, Jerry here on my left, a question but not a statement.
No, just Brendan, that man was talking about technology. Technology is so good nowadays that you never need to leave your home. You can work in your home, you can get your food into your home, you can get entertainment into your home. And in this country, 65% of the people have social welfare payments. So I would suggest that the government would give bigger money to these people that would go to the post offices to collect their benefits. And you were bringing thousands of people into society. Thank you.
I agree.
Okay, well, you can bring food into your home, but now we're going to have food in Kevin's home. So, okay, well, I think we have to wrap up. Or can it be a very quick comment? And this is it, a very quick comment.
Very quick comment. Just somebody said it, I didn't, but they said, without a vision, the people perish. And in ancient times, thousands and thousands of years ago, when cities were first formed, those cities actually fell apart. And the reason they fell apart is that people couldn't get on together in it. And that gave rise to the idea of a unifying myth. And that unifying myth was the basis of religion, which eventually...
Okay, folks, we need to hear the speaker. Go ahead.
Sorry. So that unifying myth was religion. Now, in the absence of religion, as we've reached that point now, what is going to be the unifying myth, which we undoubtedly need if we're not going to destroy the planet by tearing one another apart, as is happening in the US, where, there's no cohesion at all, it's all division and so on. So how do we avoid that aside from nuclear explosions and climate change, I think this is even more threatening, the fact that people can't get on together. That'll destroy us faster than anything else. So how do we deal with that in the absence of any unifying myth to hold us together?
Okay, if you just address that, and we'll wrap up then, and thank you, James.
Great, yeah, absolutely. And I don't feel that we're coming anywhere close to answering the question of what fills the void when Christianity declines in Western society. And I think a lot of the stranger movements in the last few years, few decades on the left, kind of the post-Christian, the wokeism, that kind of thing, is part of the response there. On the right, and there's this kind of reversion to nativism in some cases, racial identity, as opposed to the different identities which are proposed by people of a different belief system. I don't see any example, any satisfactory example of a unifying, I don't want to say unifying myth, but a unifying culture which replaces Christianity. And I think there's no answer to your question, which is the unfortunate thing if you're concerned about the survival of Western civilization.